In March 2024, Niger created a historic moment by being the first African nation to terminate military collaboration with the United States. Presently, American officials are engaged in negotiations with Niger's military leadership, seeking permission for their forces and base to remain stationed in the country. However, it remains uncertain whether Niger's government will agree to these terms. Nevertheless, it's becoming increasingly evident to the United States that its influence in the Sahel region and across Africa is waning. Despite this, the United States is reluctant to completely relinquish its foothold and is attempting to sway some African leaders to its side. Recently, U.S. military commandos visited one of Africa's most corrupt, oppressive, and abusive regimes in an effort to strengthen ties. This country is none other than Equatorial Guinea, located in Central Africa. When we mentioned that the U.S. military visited Equatorial Guinea, it wasn't merely for a sightseeing tour. These officials arrived to provide humanitarian aid and financial assistance from the U.S. government to Equatorial Guinea's president, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Masogo, a dictator who has held power for over 5 decades. The aid extended to Equatorial Guinea represents the latest effort by the U.S. to court President Teodoro. Following the donation of humanitarian aid, Commander Michael White, the defense attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Equatorial Guinea, expressed hope for further cooperation, stating, "We hope that this donation marks the beginning of increased collaboration." Similarly, U.S. Ambassador to Equatorial Guinea, David Gilmour, voiced optimism that the recent donation of medical supplies would initiate a series of opportunities for partnership with the country's government. Typically, the interaction between the United States and Equatorial Guinea might seem like a positive step, as it's common for countries to engage with each other. However, for a nation that claims to champion democracy, human rights, and anti-corruption, the willingness of the United States to collaborate with a regime that contradicts these principles, solely to maintain a military presence in Africa, exposes its hypocrisy to the world. Before delving into the United States' double standards, let's examine the oppressive and corrupt leadership of President Teodoro. For those unfamiliar with the nation, Equatorial Guinea ranks as the 3rd smallest country in Africa, boasting a population of around 6 million people. Similar to many African nations, Equatorial Guinea possesses abundant resources, notably oil. Despite its small size, this Central African nation stands as one of the wealthiest in Africa, ranking 31st globally in GDP and 9th in Africa in terms of Human Development Index. However, despite this wealth, a staggering 70% of the population lives below the poverty line, as the riches primarily benefit the government and the nation's elite. This economic disparity highlights a prevalent issue in Equatorial Guinea and other African countries, where resources are mismanaged and unequally distributed. The root of the problem lies with Equatorial Guinea's leader, President Teodoro Obiang. Following the country's independence from Spain in 1968, Francisco Matías Nguema, a former colonial administrator, assumed power as the first president. His regime, characterized by brutal repression, purges, and killings, plunged Equatorial Guinea into a period of mass suffering. Some analyses suggest that as much as a third of the population perished or fled into exile during his rule. Matías' reign stands as one of the most oppressive and brutal in global history. Following Matías' orders for the execution of several family members, his nephew, Teodoro Obiang, then a senior military figure, orchestrated a bloody coup to oust him. Since then, President Teodoro Obiang has held uncontested power in Equatorial Guinea, solidifying his status as the country's leader. Initially perceived as a more humane alternative to his uncle's regime, Teodoro's rule gradually evolved into one marked by increased brutality and authoritarianism. Despite the semblance of democracy and the presence of opposition parties, it's widely acknowledged that President Teodoro wields absolute control over the nation. Every election conducted in the country has been marred by manipulation and fraud, ensuring the president's continued grip on power. Effectively, President Teodoro has become a de facto leader for life in a nation ostensibly founded on democratic principles. Reports on human rights in Equatorial Guinea paint a grim picture, detailing instances of extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary arrests, and political imprisonments sanctioned by the state. Moreover, corruption permeates all levels of government, particularly among the upper echelons. Despite the nation's abundant wealth, President Teodoro and his inner circle continue to amass personal fortunes through monopolies on domestic commerce, as well as through revenues from timber and oil exports. In 2003, President Obiang justified his takeover of the national treasury, claiming it was to curb corruption among civil servants. However, shortly after this declaration, over $500 million found its way into more than 60 accounts controlled by him and his family at Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. In response, the United States merely slapped the bank with a $16 million fine for its involvement. 4 years later, suspicions arose regarding Obiang's use of public funds to fund lavish private estates and luxuries for himself and his family. The U.S. Department of Justice accused Obiang and his son, Teodoro, of siphoning off hundreds of millions of dollars through corruption to acquire mansions, private jets, and high-end cars in the United States. However, the case came to a close after Teodoro forfeited nearly $30 million in assets to the United States. Between 2011 and 2012, French and American authorities seized numerous assets from Obiang and his son, including mansions, rare wine collections, and luxury automobiles. Swiss prosecutors also intervened in 2016, confiscating 11 of Teodoro's extravagant cars, including Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Bentleys, a Bugatti, and a Rolls-Royce. In 2021, France took hold of $170 million worth of Teodoro's assets, among them a grand 101-room mansion near the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Nevertheless, these seizures have had little impact on Teodoro's lavish lifestyle. Despite his ostentatious spending habits, he continues to request aid from the United Nations as the Vice President of Equatorial Guinea. Yes, you read that correctly. President Obiang has appointed his son, who indulges in a life of opulence, as the vice president of the country, evidently grooming him to succeed him whenever he decides to step down from power. Despite the glaring corruption, oppression, and lack of democracy under Teodoro Obiang's presidency, the United States has chosen to turn a blind eye and pursue a partnership with Equatorial Guinea. However, it's worth noting that the same nation dispatched its senior officials to Niger with a message for the United States. They stated that their continued cooperation with Niger hinges on the nation holding elections to transition from military rule to civilian governance and refraining from forming alliances with undemocratic nations like Russia and China. Isn't this contradictory? But perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise. This isn't the first instance where the United States has prioritized its interests over its professed values of democracy and human rights. The truth is, the United States only champions democracy and human rights when it aligns with its own interests. Currently, the U.S. is focused on countering China and Russia's influence in Central Africa. Reports from 2022 reveal China's intentions to establish a military presence in Equatorial Guinea, prompting the U.S. to court the nation's president to ensure the sole military base in the country remains under U.S. control. Following a donation in February valued at $24,000, including essentials like baby formula and first aid kits, the Army issued a statement emphasizing continued cooperation between the U.S. and Equatorial Guinea. However, what raises eyebrows is the need for such a donation in a country with a president boasting a net worth of $600 million. The United States' dealings with Equatorial Guinea's presidency once again call into question its credentials as a defender of human rights and democracy. Some argue that the U.S. itself has a long history of human rights abuses, but due to its superpower status, it faces little accountability. We hope that such practices will come to an end someday. What are your thoughts on this issue? Share your opinions in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video for more updates.